people in the webinar today for you, and we'll start by very briefly introducing ourselves, and then we'll get started with the actual content of the webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, I looked over the list of people who is here, and I know a lot of you, so thanks for showing up at another webinar. But for those of you who don't know me, I have about, I hesitate to say, but coming up to 30 years of experience with PDF, and before that, some PostScript, experience with automation and experience with standardization. I actually, that is philosophically difficult, but I joined the Ghent Workgroup before it existed. So I've been there from the very beginning, working on all kinds of different things in different roles. At the moment, the most important thing is that I'm co-chair of the specification subcommittee, which is the one working on the topics that we will talk about today. And then I am joined today by Christian. And Christian, I will let you introduce yourself to the loads of people we have here.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm Christian. I think that I also know a lot of people that are attending today. I'm in the field for quite some time now. I've been in several companies, starting in packaging. I've been a brand owner with Nestle, as you can see. Worked for Enfocus, Gap System, founded two companies, Blood Process and Agile Streams. Agile Streams now being 4Piece France, and I'm currently serving as the head of customer success at 4Piece for the Ghent Workgroup. I'm a long-time member, not as long as David, but close to. Yeah, just a little bit. You won. I used to serve as chair of the packaging subcommittee and the cross-media subcommittee, and I'm now serving as the marketing officer of the Ghent Workgroup. While we announced that webinar, we got a lot of quotes on the social, so there are some that we just posted here. We're not going through them. You will be able to do it when we will be sharing the presentation. But basically, we thought that there is a lot of traction on that webinar, and we are going to do our best to make it the most interesting as possible. So let's start with some history, and it's your call, David.
Yep, I think it's pretty clear that the description and title of the webinar resonated with a lot of people, and it's something that is on people's mind, and that is actually a good thing. So we'll talk about what the point of view of the Ghent Workgroup is about standards and what you should be using and why. We thought that if we want to do that, we need to kind of position the topic. And that means talking about PDFX and derived standards. Do not worry, this is not going to take overly long, but I do think it's important. And I managed to put all of the history of PDF standards over the last 30 years in 2 slides. I will admit that I used animations, and so yeah, it might take a little bit longer, but it is very condensed, and I'm really going to try to only show you those things that that make sense in this context. So starting with PDF, PDF, which, as most of you, I would guess, know, originally was developed by Adobe, and around 2008 handed over to the ISO organization, so the International Standards Organization. And it is now an ISO standard. This is actually the only ISO standard number that I put on my slides. I know Christian has some later, but this is the only one I remember. It's also a very nice one. So PDF is ISO 32000, and what that means is that PDF is further developed and controlled by the ISO organization, and so no longer by Adobe. That is important from a standardization point of view because it is difficult to have a worldwide standard that is built on proprietary company information, in this case, the PDF files format. I think I don't need to mention that PDF by itself is not enough to ensure that something is printable. The PDF file format is used for all kinds of things. If you would look up where Adobe earns its money with PDF, you'll find that most of it, if not, well, most of it, I think, is has nothing to do with print necessarily, but is enterprise and is things related to archival, things related to accessibility. So it's a very broad file format, and as such, there was work done at some point to standardize PDF for print for our market. And that became PDFX as an ISO standard. So the overall name is PDFX, and then there are multiple versions that were created throughout the years. PDFX1A is the first standard. That might sound like one, but standards organizations are very good at coming up with complicated names for standards. So PDFX1, PDFX as a group, PDFX1A as the first standard is the first thing that was developed for print, was actually developed on PDF version 1.3. And if you want to get an idea of how old that is, PDF 1.3 is the PDF version that Adobe at the time released together with Acrobat 4. I don't know how many of you still remember Acrobat 4, but it goes down a significant amount of time, somewhere around 1999. And actually, the work on PDFX 1A started around 1999 as well. Not in ISO yet at that point, but in some organizations, mostly on the North American side of the world. And it had to do with standardization of sending advertisements between a publisher and a printer. So exchange of advertisements. The X comes from blind exchange because the concept was that you create a PDFX file as a creative professional, that you then throw it over the wall to a printer, and that the printer can print exactly what you had in mind without having to communicate with you. That is the concept of blind exchange, and that's where the X comes from. The ISO standard dates from 2001, at least the first version of the ISO standard, and then that was slightly updated, but not in a very big way, in 2003. So if you look at Adobe Illustrator, for example, and you would do save as PDF, and then you look at the standards that you can select, then you will see PDFX1A 2001 and PDFX1A 2003. They should only have the 2003 version there because that is the latest one, but that's why you have different dates. That's just a small revision. What is important to remember is this goes back to 1999. That is about 25 years ago today. So it is old standard. It is based on very old PDF technology, and that is, of course, a big part of what we're going to talk about. There was a significant update. I shouldn't really call it an update, a new part of the PDFX standard, if you want, that is called PDFX4. There were some things in between, but I'm only going to talk about the important stuff. Significant new version called PDFX4, and that is based on PDF 1.6, which you may say is a lot more recent, but it goes back to something like 2008. with, again, a small revision in 2010. So from a timeline point of view, there's something like 7 years between these two standards. And we'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between these two standards here. Again, what I want you to remember is that this is still a relatively old standard. And so if, as the Ghent Workgroup, because that is what we will do, if we will tell you that you should use PDFX4, please, and no longer PDFX1A, then don't think that we are trying to push you to use something that is brand new and just invented. It actually also already goes back something like 15 years by now. The PDF 1.6 that you see there belonged to Acrobat 7, in case you're wondering. So again, you can think of when did that appear. If I remember correctly, Acrobat 7 is somewhere around 2006 that was released. So pretty old again. And then, and this is the last PDF X version that I am going to put on here, we have something that is called PDF X6. And that is, again, a much more recent development. It is based on PDF 2.0, so a major revision of PDF. And PDF 2.0 was created by ISO. The 1.6 that we had for PDF X4 was still an Adobe development. But so 2.0 is created by ISO. And now we're talking about something like 2020. That is the date that was released. So this is much more modern, and we will also talk about what, as the Ghent Workgroup, we feel about PDFX6 and whether you should actually look at that or not. But these are the three PDFX versions that I wanted to put on here. There, like I said, are others. PDFX2, for example, doesn't exist anymore. It was retired. It was a nice idea, but not one that survived the time, I shall say. You have PDFX3, you have PDFX5, but remember the three that you see on this slide. This is what happened on the ISO side and on the PDFX side. On the other hand, we are the Ghent Workgroup, so what is important from our point of view is also what happened in the Ghent Workgroup, and we have Ghent Workgroup specifications or standards that, well, cooperate with PDFX. Each Ghent Workgroup specification is built on top of a particular version of PDFX. So we don't compete with what PDFX does. Instead, we embrace it and we build on top of it. The Ghent Workgroup started with a naming scheme that was something like 1v1 and then 1v2, 1v3. The first number refers to the PDF or referred to the PDFX version. So GWG 1v4 is built on top of PDFX 1A. And then the second number is the revision number, the version number. So the Ghent Workgroup in total released 4 revisions of a specification that was built on top of PDFX 1A. And that spanned a significant number of years. 1v4 is still used today, even though it is no longer what we think you should be using. It is a standard that is still used today. There have been some updates to that, and the most important ones were in 2015 and then in 2022. Those are built on top of PDFX4. And that is important. It means that it can take full advantage of some of the new stuff in there. We'll come to that in a second. And of course, from a timeline point of view, it's easy. It's called 2022, so it was released in 2022. So this is a relatively modern specification, but the differences between the 2022 version and the 2015 version are not that high. Both were built on top of PDFX4, So it is something that also has seen testing and a significant amount of use by people. That is the full slide. And well, what you could wonder about now is that there is nothing that is placed next to PDFX6. And so you could question, why is there no Ghent Workgroup specification that corresponds to PDFX6? And that's a very good question. And I'll start by confusing you a little bit more by showing you the next slide, and then we'll explain what the reasoning is behind that omission. But what I wanted to do in my second slide on history is simply put from a technical point of view, the differences between these PDFX versions next to each other. And so when we start with PDFX1A, as I said, the oldest version that goes back 25 years or so, we're in a world where PDF files can contain CMYK, gray, and spot color, and that's about it. Yeah, no transparency because that was not invented at that time. It was not part, well, transparency was invented, but it was not part of the PDF specification. No layers, nothing much in terms of modern features that we know and use in PDF any day today. Very limited feature set. When you look at PDFX4, then you can see that there is some more stuff in there and really interesting things, and also big changes if you want. And the biggest change is probably, and we'll come back to that in PDFX1A, there is no support for transparency, and in PDFX4, there is support for transparency. And that means that in PDFX4, you don't need to do what is called transparency flattening. That is perhaps the biggest change between these two. And we're going to talk separately about that in a few seconds. What you also see, and that is of course also important, is that there are a lot more color spaces allowed in PDFX4. Essentially, anything that is color managed is allowed in PDFX4. Now, there are two things I want to add to that very briefly. One is that I hear people say sometimes that PDFX1A is not color managed and PDFX4 is color managed. That is not correct. The PDFX1A file is absolutely color managed. There is an output intent in there that characterizes the color that you have in the file, but it is limited to CMYK. In a PDFX4 file, I could also have images that are RGB, as long as there is a proper ICC profile attached to them. So it's not the difference between is it color managed or not. The difference is what is allowed in terms of color spaces inside of these two files. And then PDFX4 allows a lot more freedom. What you also need to know, and what I need to say, is that it is not because PDFX4 allows all sorts of things that the Ghent Workgroup automatically also allows it. If you look at the GWG 2022 specification, for example, you'll find a variant that is restricted to CMYK, and you'll find a variant that is restricted to CMYK, but also allows RGB images. No RGB text or line art, but yes, RGB images, again, as long as they are properly color managed, meaning there is an ICC profile attached to them. So, as always, the Ghent Workgroup puts some additional restrictions on top of PDFX, and the goal, of course, is to have higher reliability of files that comply to the Ghent Workgroup specifications. But clearly, you have more capabilities here, and Christian will talk more about what those are specifically. If we look at PDFX6, based on 2.0, there are a number of very interesting features in there as well. The change is perhaps not as big from a pure PDF file format point of view, than the difference you saw between 1A and 4, but there are a significant amount of new things that can be done, whether it's output intents per page or page range, or we talk about document part metadata, dpart, or the inclusion of much more information about colorants and separations in there. There is a lot of stuff that is potentially very useful. And that begs the question, of course, if it's so useful, why was there that hole on the previous slide? And is there no Ghent Workgroup specification matching X6? And why, in fact, are we not going to talk about X6 anymore during this, this webinar? Well, the reason for that is that the Ghent Workgroup from the very beginning has been a very practical organization. And that means that any specification that we came up with had to be usable in practice immediately. The easiest way for me to explain why we've not done anything with PDFX6 is that if you go to Illustrator today and you save as PDF, as I said before, you have the standard section where you can choose which PDFX version you want to support. You'll find versions of PDFX4 in there. You'll find PDFX1A in there. You will not find PDFX6 in there. While there is software and hardware that supports PDFX6 and PDF 2.0 files, there is very little support for these file formats across the industry. And if you look at specifically at creative applications, there aren't many applications that can generate PDFX6 files, and there are certainly not many applications that can generate PDFX6 files that have some of these additional features. And so for the Ghent Workgroup, that means it is too early to make a specification that is based on X6. Does that mean we're not working on that, talking about that internally? No, we actually are. And we envision that at some point we will need to come up with a PDFX6 compliant specification. We prepare for that, but we don't think the market is ready to actually release that specification right now. And that was 25 years of PDF standards history in 2 slides. So let's look at RIP technology, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, David. So the thing that you've experienced into the workflow these last 25 years is really driven by the evolution of the RIP technology. So this is basically why Ghent Workgroup used to advise you to use PDFX1A standard for some point, and now is pushing into the PDFX4. Because let's go back to the basic. What is a RIP? So RIP stands for Raster Image Processor. And this is actually the system that is in charge to convert the original content of your PDF into a raster image that the plate setter or now the printing machine can understand. The older RIPs, they had to convert the PDF to PostScript first before being able to convert that into a raster image. And at this time, because it's PostScript based, that means that there is no support for transparency. The file has to be flattened. And flattening is not a harmless process. You could imagine that because a lot of people are just saying like PDFX1A is safe, and that's why they use that. David is going to tell you a little bit more about the transparency flattening, and you'll see that it's not that safe as you would imagine, and it can really harm your file. And that's exactly why at that time, because in the RIP you had to go through what is called the CPSI, which is a configurable PostScript interpreter, which was that conversion from PDF to PostScript, where the flattening was happening. One could not really expect the result that you get, because sometimes you have flows and then you get misinterpretation. And this is exactly why it has been asked to do the transparency flattening before going to the RIP, So in case something goes wrong, you have been able to look at that and see the problems. And that was the base of the PDF X1A. The modern RIPs, and when I say modern, this is really already some years ago, because the Adobe PDF print engine just went out in 2008. So that's already 15 years ago, 16 in 2024. And those RIPs, the APP-based RIPs, because Adobe is also providing that technology as OEM to other RIP vendors, or the Harlequin-based from Global Graphics, they can directly process the PDF. So they don't have to go from PDF to PostScript and from PostScript to raster image. That means that they are able to honor all the modern features that you have in the PDF right now, and that we are going to cover later in the presentation, natively. That means no transparency flattening anymore is needed. But what is transparency flattening? Let's
Well,
get
I can
David.
tell you. Very simple examples, and but at the same time, I think examples that some of you will, well, most of you will recognize and will appreciate. And the simplest way to illustrate transparency, perhaps, is by taking three objects that have a different color. You just have cyan, magenta, and yellow here, and overlap them. And then where they overlap, if these things are transparent, and I'm talking about transparency here, not overprint. If these things are transparent, then you see the other colors appear. So we now have blue, green, red, and in the middle something that should be black if the monitor does a good job. If you transparency flatten that, it looks the same. I actually changed slides now. It's difficult to see over this kind of connection, but this looks essentially the same. The only thing you might see, I can see it on my side, you might be able to see it on your side, is that where the colors touch, there is this hint of a white border between the colors. And that is very, very typical for transparency flattened files. Why? Well, because essentially when you look at the objects in this file, so if I look at the original one, I have three objects, three circles that overlap. If I look at my transparency flattened file, the transparency flattening process changes my file, and now I have 7 objects. Why? Well, there is no concept of transparency anymore. So if I have color changes, I need to do that in a different way. So what you're looking at is a bunch of opaque objects where each object has a specific color. And this file with 3 objects is now a file with 7 objects. This is very, very typical for transparency flattening. It breaks up the objects that you have in your file. Remember that. That's going to come back in the summary of why this is a bad idea. This is another idea. For those of you who thought that I was going to make a presentation without any penguins in it, here is the dimension of them. But what you see here is, you could say, 3 objects. The way that PDF works, I would probably guess 5 objects. You have 2 colored rectangles and then 3 lines of text. Yeah. So if you would look at this from a very basic level, you will have 5 objects in this file. However, because this file is transparency flattened, each of these lines of text is present 3 times in the file, and then it has been clipped to the borders of these rectangles. Because if you look properly, the text that overlaps the yellow rectangle is actually green, and what you have over the magenta rectangle is actually blue. So the transparency flattening process again needs to break this up. Yeah, this was a file saved from Illustrator. It did a reasonably good job in the sense that it is all still live text, and it just included every line 3 times. One's green, one's cyan, and one's blue. What you'll see is that in many cases, it will do way more horrible things. It might actually rasterize some of this text inside of my image, for example. Yeah. This is one of those examples where you see that can have effects that you don't want. If you have objects that overlap, that may be easy to do in a world where you have transparency. And if you have drop shadows and similar effects, you already have transparency. It may be easy to do in a world where you have transparency, but if you flatten that type of file, well, the flattening engine has to do something to make it appear to not change the appearance, but remove the transparency that was used. And this may end up in things like what you see on the right-hand side, where I now have a differently colored box behind the text, because that's the only thing the flattening engine could do with that type of file. And the more complex a file, the more you're going to run into such issues. So when you think that transparency flattening is not a bad idea, think about all of these points. It really complicates PDF files. It will make it bigger in size because it's breaking up stuff into multiple pieces in order to retain the visual appearance. It, in many cases, makes it more difficult to print. More complex files typically have more risk when they are printed. It reduces editability, of course. Remember that example with the 3 lines of text. If I wanted to do text editing on that, I essentially no longer can, because it would completely mess up the colors in that file. It can cause alignment issues, and that is very hard to show in a webinar, but it is essentially what I mentioned. Where objects touch, or where the transparency flattening engine has cut objects apart, you have this risk that there are white lines. And often that is only a visual effect that you will see in Acrobat or in Reader, but in some cases it may actually print like that as well, and you have defects on the printed file. And it can cause all kinds of color issues. Yeah? A good example, again, could have been this text overlapping other objects where the text is partially converted to an image. And in many workflows, images and text or vector objects are not color managed the same. And so you're going to end up with color differences on the borders of these objects. And as a last line in here, Christian talked about RIPs and about what they do. What I hear sometimes from people is that transparency flattening cannot be that bad because essentially, in the end, the PDF has to be ripped, and that's the same thing, right? But it's not. When you send a PDF file to a RIP, the RIP prepares the file for output. And yes, it converts it to pixels at that point, and those pixels will be printed, but the RIP knows what's going to happen with that file. It is not going to break up objects into other objects and manipulate the color spaces. It is simply going to calculate what it is going to use in terms of pixels. The transparency flattening engine has to do something that is completely different and much more difficult. And it does it at a much earlier point in the workflow. So you don't have all of the information about where the file is going to be printed, at what resolution is it going to be printed, perhaps what other software parts in the workflow does it have to go through. These two cannot be compared with each other. They are essentially different things. So, after transparency flattening, let's look at some of the other modern features that you can have in a PDFX4 file that you cannot have in PDFX1A.
So for these features, which are the 4 that David showed you in a previous slide that we will focus on the PDF X4, are the live transparency, which has been introduced in PDF version 1.4. So it's not the 1.6 that is using on PDFX4, but if 1.4 can do it, 1.6 can also. And there's no debate here. It's just like every file that you're going to get today is going to contain some sort of transparency. Could be a drop shadow, a special effect, different blend modes. You're going to have to handle those files in your workflow. In terms of the layers, which has been introduced by PDF 1.5, this is something that has been used for ages in the packaging industry, for example, where you can actually separate some content and break down into separate layers where you see exactly that layer is meant to be this or that. And this is very useful. And this is allowing to have some automation in your file in the workflow. Specifically, this is that processing steps standard that has been invented in the Ghent Workgroup and pushed to the ISO under the number 19593-1. I like those funky numbers of the ISO. 32,000 is much more easy to remember. So this standard, the processing steps, actually use the layers where you attach metadata, and by qualifying those different layers, you can have a specific content that is attached to it. So it could be the cutting part or creasing, or it's where you want to have the barcode, hologram, it's only some panel, etc. By using that standard, you allow the automation down the line by just being able to address those different objects in the file and drive them to the correct machine or process. In that case, it's a way to make your file smarter because you know exactly what the content means. It's not only like objects that have been put on a white page. After that, we have also the JPEG 2000 compression, which has been introduced with PDF 1.6. And when using that kind of compression, you can actually decrease the file size by using a more modern compression algorithm. And you can have better quality with a smaller file when you use that kind of compression. You can even have some non-destructive mode with the JPEG 2000 if you're not compressing too much. And color managed images, this is something that you can use in that case where you have images like using spot colors or more than 4 colors. You can have images that are really using the extended gamut for 6 or 7 color presses, for example. And in that case, if you can keep them into the PDF and rip them at the end, you'll be able to have the most accurate and the most colorful way of your images on the paper that you're printing. If you do some transparency flattening, for example, or convert to CMYK, then you're going to lose part of that gamut. And with the digital printing that is more and more used everywhere, this can probably be kind of a pity to just reduce that gamut when you can have more. As David said before, even though you can do that, you're not forced to do it into the PDF X4. And like at the Ghent Workgroup, we have that specification that is actually reducing to CMYK. So if this is something that you need because you want to control exactly how your images are converted to CMYK before giving that to the RIP, this is definitely possible as well. There's no question. You're going to get the files that are containing live transparency layers, JPEG 2000 compression, or color managed images. That's definitely the case. You get that every day. So you have to handle that. And everything that you have here is going to be lost if you convert that to PDF X1A because it cannot handle those things. So you really need to take that into account if you want to decrease the number of errors that you might encounter into your workflow and to keep the most of the features that you have in the PDF. Is that risky? Maybe.
It's always going to be risky, right? And that is the point that we want to make. We also don't want to hide the fact that in some cases things are going to go wrong as well. Uh, I want to summarize it like this, and this may be controversial, but I think it is correct. What I hear very often from people is something along the lines of, I really want to use PDFX4 because I know it's more modern, but I have these files that I've seen somewhere over the last couple of years where there is a problem with this or that. And seriously, I sympathize. I know there are a lot of crappy files out there, and we get files that are not 100% okay, and we get all kinds of weird cases and corner. I really do understand that. I've been doing support for PDF-based workflows for a very long time, and so I think I've seen my share of dubious files. But then just use PFX4 anyway. And there is a reason I'm saying, actually, my sentiment is much stronger than that, but I'll leave it at just use PDFX4 anyway. The reason is that you're a printer, and when you're in this in this webinar, you're either a printer or you're a publisher or you're someone on the creative side of things. But we want to produce things at the end of a workflow. And then the situation is really, really simple. You're going to have things that go well, and you're going to have things that don't go so well. Yeah. And the question is not, is it going to go wrong? Yes, it is going to go wrong. There is a risk with what we're doing. PF is complex, the software is complex, the output machinery is complex. You are going to get things where things go wrong. The question is, how can you get the highest percentage of good prints and the lowest percentage of bad prints? That really is the essence. It's a risk management exercise. Yeah. And while I have seen workflows or cases where there is a systemic reason in the workflow that where people go like, oh, we have to use this 30-year-old software. Okay, then you probably have a valid reason not to switch to PDFX4, although I would say you also have a valid reason to look at your workflow quite closely and see why you still have to use the 30-year-old, but that's something else. But in most workflows, the fact that there is something that goes wrong with 1 or 2 or X% of files should not be the reason to say we're going to stick to PDFX1A. You have to do risk analysis and look at, where do I get the highest percentage of problems? If you would have asked me this or the Ghent Workgroup this 10 years ago, the answer would more than likely have been, use PDFX1A. It is widely supported. It is going to give you the best results, and maybe not the best results, but the least amount of problems. If you ask this question today with what we know about the software that advanced and the devices that get better, and with the problems that we see with transparency flattening, the answer is no longer use PDFX1A. The answer is, please look at PDFX4 and use that. And chances are really high that you're going to improve the error rate that you see with files. However, do it wisely. And so that leads to the last topic that Christian is going to talk about in this webinar. Do it wisely.
Communication. Communication is key. Definitely, you're not going to change from X1A to X4 just over the weekend. Just like you've seen that webinar, you find that interesting, you say it's probably the moment that I have to switch, and you're just changing the setting in your workflow. You're not questioning the people that are above you or after you in the chain, and just press the button and everything is going to be wonderful. You're not going to have any other problem. Of course not. You have to, communicate with the people to be sure that they are going to be able to handle those files. And for that, you need to do some testing. And not going live in production on day one. For that, you need to see if the people that are upstream or downstream, if the workflow is behaving correctly. You have to send some test files to see if the result that you're getting on the print is what you were expecting. How would you do that? By using the Ghent PDF output suite from the Ghent Workgroup, which is probably the best tool to test this. It's available for free on our website. You can download it and then you can test it through your workflow. So that means into the software, but also the RIP and going to the final print. How does it look? It's actually test chart where you have a lot of patches. David, if you could just go to the next slide.
I could if.
Yes, thank you.
There you go.
So it looks like that. So you have actually here a collection of patches that have been developed by the Ghent Workgroup to test every specific part of a PDF that could, end wrong. And those different patches have been aggregated into 6 pages that you can run through your workflow to see if everything is in order. How to use that? It's again something that is really easy. You have that output suite where you can check everything that is around the CMYK, the spot, and the color manage parts. And in the next slide, please, David. Thank you. You have for each patch, you have a README that comes with it that explains exactly what is the purpose of the patch. What are you testing on that patch? How is it working? And if you have an error, where it can come from. It's really easy to use. You have to test it, you'll see. There's no specific knowledge to understand if it's okay or not okay. You have patches like the ones that you see here on that slide, where on the left side, you can see that everything is correct because you see the patches that are in full color. And on the right, you can see that the part in the left is not correct because you see a cross. And this is a concept of what has been developed here. You have visual result that can tell you if the file is behaving correctly or not, the workflow is behaving correctly or not, and you get on the final print what is on the file. So I really advise you to use that because this is really, really useful to test your workflow and be able to see if the tools that you're using are really behaving correctly on a modern workflow.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will see many of you again in an upcoming webinar, and all that rests us is to wish you a very pleasant rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye.